Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the discussion, Dirty Business, the plan endorsed by the South Australian Royal Commission to allow international radioactive waste dumps in Australia. What are its implications? My name is Joe Nagy. I'm a member of the committee. Before we begin, I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we're gathered, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their leaders, past and present. Our speaker tonight is Dave Sweeney, an anti-nuclear campaigner from the Australian Conservation Foundation. For 3 decades, David Sweeney has watched, written, and worked on nuclear, resource, and Indigenous issues in Australia. In the 1980s, he protested against the development of massive Olympic Dam uranium mine in South Australia, which I'm sure many of you will remember, and the U.S. military bases in Central Australia. He has worked with Friends of the Earth in Australia and Friends of the Earth International. He traveled to Eastern Europe after the Chernobyl cloud disaster and worked in Dublin, I hope you didn't drink too much of their beer, on the campaign, David, to stop radioactivity from the Sellafield nuclear plant poisoning the Irish Sea. In the 1990s, he worked as a freelance print journalist specializing in environmental and resource issues before spending 4 years producing Stick Together, an award-winning weekly national public radio program exploring industrial and resource issues. After a stint as a media advisor with Oxfam, David joined the fight against the Howard government's push to open a new uranium mine in Kakadu, and was part of the national and international campaign that successfully halted the Jabiluka mine plan. Since the late 1990s, Dave has worked with the Australian Conservation Foundation Nuclear Free Campaign. This work has taken him all around Australia and across the world, highlighting and also hindering the nuclear industry and working with people directly affected by this controversial and contaminating trade. He has worked on successful campaigns to stop radioactive waste dumping in South Australia and on the current national campaign to stop a contested dump plant at Muckaty in the Northern Territories, where I understand our speaker who's absent tonight is involved with at the moment, as well as on campaigns to halt plans for new and expanded uranium mines. This has seen David engage closely with the Aboriginal people. He currently lives and works in Melbourne, don't hold that against him, and holds a vision of a nuclear-free Australia that is positive about its future and honest about its past. So now please again welcome David.
Thanks very much, Joe. And thanks to Win and to Jan and all the crew and the committee from Politics in the Pub for the invitation and the opportunity to be here tonight. It's a great pleasure. I'm really happy to be here tonight. The first one after of the financial year, the first one of a new government, and it's all roundabouts and swings. Should we clap? It's an extremely astute question. It's all roundabouts and swings. There's that old saying, no matter who you vote for, a politician wins. It's all roundabouts and swings. We know that it's far more, that social change is more than ticking a box once every 3 or 4 years. But for everybody who was involved, I hope that you got the best result possible. And to those who are pursuing a progressive political agenda, I wish all of us all the best of luck over the next few years. I also want to again acknowledge the traditional owners of this country and sovereignty never ceded, and that's important not just because it reminds us of the unfinished business that is the fundamental flaw in the body politic of this nation, but it also is important because in the context of tonight's talk, it is Indigenous people who here and internationally bear a disproportionate impact of the burden of the negative impacts of the nuclear industry. Tonight's topic is about radioactive waste, and there's a Native American activist who's worked long and hard on this issue called Winona LaDuke, and one of her quotes about radioactive waste is that for 50 years some of the brightest minds in the world have been looking for an answer, and now they've come up with it, they've found it. It's to find Indian land. It's to find a dirt road on Indian land. It's to drive to the end of that dirt road and empty your truck. It's not quite as bad or as bleak as that in South Australia, but there's resonances of that and there's parallels of that. So radioactive waste is an issue that's not always on the radar, but it's an issue that is always there. It's a growing international environmental and public health and management issue, and it's one of growing significance in Australia. South Australia might be a fair way from the Harold Park, but it's not that far. It's not that far, and it is the only jurisdiction in Australia that right now, today, is in the frame for both national and international radioactive waste dumps. Active proposals and active pushing. Now, this is a long-running issue in South Australia, but the recent chapter is indeed recent and very significant. I don't want to drown us in detail tonight. What I want to do is, to you as a group of connected, progressive, concerned people, put one more issue on your radar of issues. Just to keep an ear open, an eye open, a heart open to the calls as they become more focused and sharp. So if we go back just less than 18 months, February or March 2015, South Australian Premier Jay Weatherall initiated a Royal Commission, a very high-level instrument to look at plans to expand, opportunities to expand the nuclear industry in South Australia. It was across four broad areas: uranium mining, value-adding or uranium enrichment and reprocessing, nuclear power, and nuclear waste. So why did a left Premier in a Labor state do this? Well, the South Australian economy was, and still in many ways is, flatlining. The long budgeted $25-30 billion expansion of Olympic Dam that had been long budgeted and predicated and looked forward to and spoken up was not going ahead. BHP Billiton made that decision after Fukushima because of uncertainty in the price of uranium. So that bucket of money disappeared. Vehicle building at Elizabeth was disappearing. Defence contracts were sailing over the horizon. And that trifecta of economic woes, coupled with the perverse influence, oddly enough, of Olympic Dam, that mega mine in northern South Australia, a strong pro-nuclear group in state Labor and in the South Australian media, and the direct influence, and it's an interesting one because I know some of you are academics, the direct influence of University College London Annex within the University of Adelaide, where there is a Nuclear Studies Institute, which is an annex of UCL London and which has been quite successfully and in a very sustained way promoting all things nuclear for a decade in South Australia. So you put those things, those players together with an embattled economy, and there seems what was possibly looked like a good idea over the summer: let's have a Royal Commission into ways to expand the nuclear industry. So right from the start, I don't think you need to be sitting down to hear that environment organisations and many Aboriginal organisations were either hostile or at least deeply concerned. We were deeply concerned because of the appointment of the Commissioner, the Royal Commissioner, former South Australian Governor Kevin Scarce. He'd earlier made comments that were pro-nuclear. He had been, in his earlier life, a Rear Admiral and career military, born in the Woomera Rocket Range in the north of South Australia, steeped in the military culture in the Australian Navy, which he joined at the age of 16, Defence Attaché in Washington, where you get the chip. So not really a neutral player to come in for a cold clinical evaluation. We were concerned because of the composition of the expert panel, which assisted the Royal Commissioner. 5 people, 1 former President of the Australian Conservation Foundation, Emeritus Professor Ian Lowe, anti-nuclear; 1 South Australia's Chief Scientist, studiously neutral; 3 aggressively pro-nuclear. including people that had commercial operations and commercial benefits from the nuclear industry. So these early concerns were vindicated as the process commenced and unfolded. There was some of the stuff about this, the Royal Commission process, is quite extraordinary. This was 2015, 2016. The submission process was absolutely arcane. It was a public submission process, but you had to get it witnessed. Your submission, your personal view, needed to be witnessed on an accredited form by a JP or a sergeant of police. Now that is automatically going to preclude a lot of people saying, I want to have my say. So it was arcane and unnecessarily exclusive. There was fly-in, fly-out style consultation. The Royal Commissioner and one or two others would fly quickly into an Aboriginal community or a regional or remote community in South Australia, often with scant notification, have 30 to 45 to 50 to 60 minutes, 30 to 60 minutes on the ground, and then leave. There was no material provided despite repeat requests, no material provided in language, Aboriginal languages, for Aboriginal people who were obviously most concerned about what this might mean for them. There was an explicit refusal and repeat refusal by the Royal Commissioner and the Royal Commission process to actually hear from environment organisations. South Australian Conservation Council, representing 50 conservation groups in South Australia, the Australian Conservation Foundation, Friends of the Earth Australia, repeatedly requested to present, to speak to our 250-page joint submission, and that was repeatedly refused. International trips that the Commissioner went on, it was overwhelmingly pro-nuclear and industry people that he met in Finland, in the US, in France, in the States. So all this goes along, and then in February 2016, February of this year, the interim findings of the Royal Commission are released. And some of them are good. They're good in relation to uranium, and they're good in relation to nuclear power. It basically says, look, these things are unpopular, unprofitable, oversupplied, there's not really much of a future in them. But there's one part where they were literally glowing, and that was the old adage of there's money in muck. And the report basically said there is an enormous opportunity for South Australia in hosting up to 1/3 of the world's radioactive waste. And that's what the deal is. That is what is actively under consideration with this proposal. The proposal is for South Australia to progressively open the door to 1/3, 138,000 tonnes of high-level radioactive waste. It's a 120-year project, which even according to the Pro-Nuclear Royal Commission would require the material to be kept in isolation for a period of not less than 100,000 years. Now it's big. Everything about it's big. It's a big cost. It's a $145 billion cost. And over that 120 years, they believe that that $145 billion investment will return $250 billion. The plan is for a dedicated South Australian port and rail line that would see 250 tonnes of high-level radioactive waste imported every month, and a further 50 shipping containers of long-lived intermediate level waste imported every month for the next 70 years. This would be transferred from ship to shore near the port and stored at a site near the port above ground for periods of between 15 and 100 years. At the peak of that process, above ground in that site would be 70,000 tonnes of waste. The material would then be moved for deep burial, for emplacement, deep geological emplacement, no intention to recover. That would be at a non-identified site. And by the time that they had identified a site, got the necessary regulatory approvals and built a facility of a standard that could host this material, there would be 50,000 tonnes of waste sitting above ground in containers at or near a South Australian port. The scale is massive. Jacobs Consulting, who did a lot of the economic modelling for the Commission, said this is by far the largest waste operation in existence. Now, it's not in existence. I believe that if we work well, cooperatively, cleverly and effectively, it will never be in existence. That's what we'll be working to see. But the idea is there. There's detailed studies. There are people talking it up. The biggest in existence. So the final report of the South Australian Royal Commission was released in May of this year, just recently. Very stage managed. And whoever is running the communications and outreach and framing and positioning and all those modern communication terms of this project is very good at their job. I tip my hat to you. Don't like what you do, but you're very good at how you do it. Because when the final report came out, a lot of journalists were like, oh yeah, okay, radioactive waste, 1/3 of the world's high-level stuff, yeah, old news. Because when they rolled it out in February, it was like, yeah, well, don't get too excited, Dave. Don't get too excited because, like, it's just an interim report. We'll see what happens. And then when you get excited again in May, well, we heard that. They said they were going to do that in February. So everything about this has been stage managed, and pushed towards an outcome. And the issue has been increasingly framed as an economic issue, as if what is being proposed is any sort of manufacturing or any sort of, indeed, mining. It's being framed solely or predominantly as an economic issue, and the dollar signs have been seen and sold far bigger and more effectively than the danger signs. And I'll give you an example. Adelaide is a one-paper town. So those of you who know the place will know it's the Adelaide Advertiser. And the Adelaide Advertiser, speaking of the planned facility and the Royal Commission, said that the findings were predictable to most observers. In fact, when the Royal Commission was called a year ago, most of us predicted this, because the dump, it says that nuclear power, mining, we understand why there's no legs on them. But the dump, on the other hand, has long been an opportunity for a major payday. In politics and among the experts, this was the conclusion that was always expected. The most striking thing about the Commission's finding is the sheer scale of wealth a high-level dump could inject into the state. It's an almost unimaginably large bucket of money. Imagine Scrooge McDuck swimming through a money bin of glowing gold coins. Now that's high-level economic rigour and analysis. But that's what's being pushed out there. South Australians were told by the not-to-be-lamented former Liberal Senator Sean Edwards that they would never pay again. They would never pay a power bill again if this went through. South Australians have been told that tram lines will be extended, new hospitals will be built, new Adelaide Oval could be built every year. So, the Royal Commission, I don't want to seem like I'm jumping at shadows, because the Royal Commission is heavily resourced. There's been $10 million spent on this process to date. 10 million, not inconsiderable. And the Royal Commission's primary finding, after a year of going around and talking and listening and perusing literature, was that the opportunity for a high-level radioactive waste facility should be actively pursued and as soon as possible. So their agenda is very clear. So who supports this agenda? Well, the Royal Commissioner, Kevin Scarce, Business South Australia, and a range of business and advocacy groups. Some in South Australian Labor, the Adelaide Advertiser, some other media and some senior current and former politicians, Alexander Downer, Warren Mundine, Bob Hawke, Julie Bishop. So it's a desperate but connected group. Who opposes it? Well, the environment groups, state and national, without exception. Many Aboriginal organisations, from community organisations to peak representative bodies and prescribed body corporates. Some trade unions and faith groups. Federal Labor, the Australian Greens, and there's increasing concern from the Nick Xenophon team. Who's neutral? Who's undecided in the early days of this grand positioning? Well, the South Australian Government, formally, the South Australian Liberals, some trade unions, many in the South Australian community. So what happens from here? The guts of what happens from here is that in late November of this year, Premier Weatherall will front the South Australian Parliament with the South Australian Government's formal response to the Royal Commission's recommendations. In order to inform the South Australian Government's response, there has been a citizen jury process set up, 50 people, moderated, facilitated process, meant to be representative and identify valid community concerns. Running alongside that, there's a South Australian parliamentary inquiry into the issue, and both of these things are meant to inform the Premier's consideration. Now, today is Bastille Day, which isn't a bad day to talk about citizens' juries. Citizens' juries are a good model for a whole range of participatory thinking, but they're not a good model when the project at hand is highly contentious, highly technical, and where there is a constrained time frame. You can't bring 50 people into a room cold and say, over 4 Saturdays, you are to come up with the framework that will guide a material that has to be isolated from people, from country, for 100,000 years. And by the way, it needs to be in by about mid-October. So we're concerned that what these sort of constraints do is move this process from one of interrogation to one of legitimisation. It's been a well-controlled and well-managed, stage-managed process, and it's all with a very limited framing about the benefits of the dollars, and the discussion is restricted or shaped around the Royal Commission report. So there's limited terms, limited time, limited capacity to interrogate. Obviously, we've got a range of concerns, big concerns. There's environmental and public health concerns. You look at the track record of radioactive waste management in Australia, we've had 20 years of failing to find a national site. I want to talk a bit later, a bit briefly about that, because South Australia is also in the frame for a separate, but in some ways related, national radioactive waste project. We look at the situation internationally. In America, they spent in New Mexico $15 billion trying to put high-level waste at a place called Yucca Mountain before it was abandoned. In America, again, that was Nevada, Yucca Mountain. And in America, in New Mexico, there was the WIP plant, Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. Now that was the world's only deep geological disposal plant, and it was meant to last for scores of years, and it's now indefinitely shut down following an unforeseen fire. No resumption state. That's the reality in the States. In Germany, in most countries in the world, there are major and unresolved problems. In Germany, in good faith, with German engineering in the 1970s, they put a whole lot of radioactive waste buried at a place called Ass, and now they've realised that the integrity of the barrels has been compromised, it's leaking, and there's this massive debate. Is it worse to dig it up and remove it and repackage it, or do we leave it there and try and put in barriers, or who do we say sorry to? And these are the Germans who are smart, technically competent, nuclear familiar, deep pockets, and with a maturity in social policy and technical policy that we don't have in this country, quite frankly, the way they have debates. And with good faith, what they did less than 5 decades ago has fundamentally failed. It doesn't hold confidence for rushing this through, as the Commissioner says, as fast as possible. You look at the issues about shipment, transport accidents, you look at all of these concerns about groundwater, leakage, spillage. Then there's a whole range of other concerns that are sadly the reality of the time we're currently living in. Security concerns, terror concerns, access of people of ill will wanting to access the material, and I don't care if it kills me, it is going to be spectacular. Here's the world's largest radioactive waste dump, and it's just been taken out by affiliates of. Fill in the gap. So that then brings with it a whole other range of concerns and a range of issues. The way that you deal, how do you deal with a legitimate security threat to a nuclear material? You increase surveillance. You increase attention to civil society groups that don't like nuclear. You have more and more police powers. You do all those things that further erode, and the snake eats its tail again. There's deep and profound concerns, and this is one of the big drivers for environment organisations as well. Cultural impact, human impact, and the human rights impact for Indigenous people. In South Australia, Aboriginal people have really had a rough go from the nuclear industry, be it mining, be it earlier waste disposal proposals were fought by the Cooper-Pedy Kungajudas and others, or be it Maralinga, the continuing lasting legacy of Maralinga. So this threat of a third of the world's undying waste coming in to be put on their country really does have many Aboriginal people concerned, deeply concerned. There's also a concern not just about radiation exposure, but about economic exposure. Like this is a big ticket item, a lot of money. Really difficult to do the costings. The assumptions in the Royal Commission are generously described as heroic. Really difficult to do the costings with this stuff. Even the OECD's own nuclear energy unit says that you cannot reasonably apply a lot of the economic costings and models for times longer than 20 or 30 years. And this is 120 years. The Australia Institute, many of you will be familiar with the Australia Institute, did an extremely useful and insightful analysis of the economics of this proposal. And they tore it to shreds. And Richard Dennis from the Institute said, if any other industry said, start building us $145 billion worth of infrastructure that'll take you 120 years to finish, and we'll start paying you in about 10 years, they would be laughed out of town. And that's pretty much the case, because there is, and it's clear, if you look not in the report, but in the appendix and the detailed documents, there would be a $300 to $600 million public expenditure before contracts were signed and deals were done. So that's $500 million South Australian taxpayers' dollars put into the promise that a bunch of creepy companies are going to come good with their money so that we look after their waste. Any way you cut it, there are real issues and concerns here. So the Premier's statement in late November is very important. And ultimately, this is an issue, like most, that's not just about the technical details, the dollars, the this, the that. Ultimately, it's an issue that's driven by and shaped by values. And the value or the question really is, does South Australia, or indeed does Australia's best economic hope lie in hosting the world's worst industrial waste? Is the best that we can do to open the door to the worst that's out there? And so that's a value question which is missing from this sort of more utilitarian, more functional economic framing as well. Now, clearly this is not just Adelaide's decision, Jay Weatherall's decision, South Australia's decision. It would impact all of Australia. And that's why it's really important to discuss it and raise it here. It would impact all Australia. And for it to go ahead and for it to get traction, at the moment it's just at that starting to get, but for it to get traction it would require bipartisan federal political support. It requires national and international agreements and instruments. It requires changes to existing laws. It requires new laws, new regulatory arrangements and capacity. A lot of Canberra consent. Now currently that federal political bipartisanship isn't there. Federal Labor have recently reasserted that they remain strongly opposed to the importation of high-level radioactive waste. The Australian Greens have consistently been. And importantly, in the recent federal election context, the Nick Xenophon team, who obviously play a significant role in South Australian discourse and politics, said that they are increasingly concerned about the idea of importing radioactive waste. So our desire is not to see South Australia's future go down the path of a radioactive waste dump or become a sacrificial dumping ground for the world's radioactive waste. That's not good for South Australian people or community. It's not good, nor is it good for those of us that are working to wean the industry or the global energy away from nuclear, away from fossil fuel into renewables. Because this proposal, when you read it, it's not about waste minimisation. It's not about reducing the production of this material. It is about enabling more of it. It's like, let's just have a spot where we can dump the skip and we can keep the party going. And that's just not on. There's an ecological principle that if you've got a problem, you don't put a filter at the end of the pipe. You try and stop the problem going down the pipe at day one. Reduction at source. So this, for a whole range of reasons, is a disturbing proposal. And our what we want to do is make people aware of it. We want to also, a pretty simple strategy, which is to make state Labor in South Australia cautious, stop being Scrooge McDuck and Rivers of Gold, and start being a government thinking long term. We want state Labor to be cautious, we want federal Labor to be bold. They've got a policy which is reasonable, which is prudent, which is popular, which exists. We're not, like we usually are, asking him to do something. We're asking him just to hold the line on what they've already got. So state Labor cautious, federal Labor bold, and to support those communities that are most in the frame. We've been here in this country before. In the late 1990s, there was a push very similar to this, but very differently handled. And I'd be interested if there's people that are into communications and how things are rolled out. This would be a fantastic case study. You could do a doctorate. Because in the late 1990s, it was top down. There was a group called Pangea Resources, that wanted to set up an international waste dump in Australia. So they did some quiet meetings with politicians. They did a lot of briefings. They did talk with European utilities about what sort of volumes they might have. They did all this top-down, creepy, behind-the-door stuff. And when the word came out, and it did, Friends of the Earth received a Pangea internal promotional video and screened it at Parliament House. It was like the light came on in the dirty kitchen, all the roaches went scurrying, all sorts of laws were passed overnight, everyone put their hand on their heart and said, not here. All good, all good. Pangea, tail between their legs, disappeared. But the idea didn't disappear. Radioactive waste as a massive and unresolved problem has not and hasn't disappeared. And now this is back, but it's so different because now it's back in and let's have a discussion about it. Let's have a forum, but it'll be at an obscure time and there's only 2 of you that can come. And it's all been rolled out in a very, very 21st century project management, tick the box. Are we all consulted? Are we all good on that? Moving along conversation way. But the guts of what's at stake in this report is that a group of people want to bring a third of the world's radioactive waste into this country, and they want South Australians in the first instance to pay for the first chunk of it with no guarantees, with scant assurance, and with an edge of desperation as if it's a fire sale. It's not linked to any ecological performance or improvement or any industry improvements in standards and practices. And it's seeing a massive and grave human and environmental threat as a business opportunity. It's completely the wrong lens to look at what is a really major problem. So it must be halted. We're the crew to hold it. We've done it before. We need to do it again. I'd like to have a little, I'd take applause if you want, but I'd like to have a little pause about there and then just have a go, okay, that's That's the main one. That's the topic for tonight. But it would be really remiss if I didn't tell you about a parallel one, if I can.
Go ahead.
Yep. A parallel process happening because it confuses people, because there's two sets of radioactive waste discussions in South Australia. One is the international one through the Royal Commission. The second is that South Australia is now the only spot in Australia under active consideration for a national radioactive waste dump. Now, like was said in the introduction, there was the proposal, the earlier proposal, like Joe said, that was at Muckaty in the Northern Territory, was defeated after 8 years by that community. So the federal government, after that time, they failed in the federal court in June 2014. They then had a revised approach under then Resource Minister McFarlane, and that the new bit there was that it needed to be a voluntary nomination of a site. So between March and May in 2015, the federal government opened up and said, Department of Industry this is, we will receive nominations from any landholder of any tenure in any part of Australia who has 100 hectares that they would like to offer to the Commonwealth for us to consider as a site for a national radioactive waste facility. They put ads all around the joint, local papers, all sorts of places. And after that 2 months, they got 28 nominations. 6 of them were advanced for further consideration through a process of, looking at metrics and where they were and were they on protected areas and were they next to creeks, etc. In late March of this year, one of the 6 was chosen as the preferred, not as the declared site, but as the preferred site for further study. That's a place called Bandiuda. It's in the Flinders Ranges. It's close to Hawker, for those of you who know that area. It's a very beautiful part of the world. The traditional owners are the Anyamutna people, the people of the hill. And the Villiwarrana Aboriginal community lives here. The pastoral station Bandiuda, where the government has selected for further study for a national site, is the next door property. They've got an Indigenous protected area. They're doing all this work and they're just seeing this idea of this goes down the gurgler as radioactive waste comes in. And the person who owns the pastoral lease, that's the one under consideration, was a former president of the Liberal Party in South Australia and a former Liberal senator called Grant Chapman, who 20 years ago, in 1996, chaired a parliamentary committee that said that Australia needs a single national radioactive waste dump. And 20 years later, synchronicity perhaps. So the Indigenous people are opposed. They're very strongly opposed on cultural, health and heritage grounds. There's growing regional concern. It was a big factor in the recent federal election in that electorate of grey. And there was a massive swing against the Liberals in a very large, it's nearly all of South Australia apart from metro area. Massive northern seat and strongly Liberal for 25 or 30 years. And big swing against. He wasn't unseated, Rowan Ramsey, but he was chastised. Now the ball is fully in the hand of the Resource Minister. Currently Josh Frydenberg, might still be, might not be. But whoever is Reform's Resource Minister in the next government has a decision. They can, like the traditional owners have made it really clear that they're fully opposed at a local level and at their representative body, the Anyamutna Traditional Lands Association. So the minister could, and it's fully their jurisdiction and their discretion. They could decide to listen to the traditional owners, or they could decide to try and override them. And we are putting as much statement and pressure and basically a plea into whoever that minister is, if it's Frydenberg or someone else, not to repeat 20 years of flawed and failed imposition on Aboriginal people, and to move away from a search for a postcode and instead embrace a genuine commitment to a proper and inclusive process. We are not stepping away from the fact that Australia needs to manage the radioactive waste that exists. We need to. needs to be managed effectively, responsibly. You don't do that by trying to either break or bribe or bulldoze some of the poorest people in the country. You don't do that by not listening to Aboriginal people. It's got to be done better than that. So there's no need for Australia to rush this. 95% of Australia's radioactive waste, the stuff slated for the national facility, is in 2 secured federal facilities today, down at Sutherland or at Woomera. And Sutherland is currently being upgraded. There is no reason to rush. We've got the time to finally do it properly and do it well and do it right, and we need to. Now I just wanted to put that on as a bit of an appendage because people get really confused between the national and international. And I suppose if I had to sort of praise it down from ACF as a national environment groups organisation as our approach to radioactive waste issues in Australia right here, right now, I'd say that we have an open mind as to how we can most responsibly manage our own waste. We're open for dialogue, subject to preconditions of responsibility, transparency and non-imposition. We have an open mind of how we can responsibly manage our own waste, and we are absolutely demanding a closed door to any plans to import international waste. Thank you very much.